The IG report came out today, and I want to say a couple of preparatory remarks before I get into it. But the IG report is the Inspector General report. It is put out, is a federal law that created an Inspector General's office in many federal agencies. So many agencies have these. Their job, they are not directly employed by the agency. They're independent, and their job is to oversee, watch and make sure that federal law is being followed. Just be a check and balance on these behemoth, massive federal agencies. So we had an Inspector General report issued related to, and I want to just tell you what it's actually related to, because there are so many controversies going on in Washington that I kind of want to distinguish and make clear we know what we're talking about. So the Inspector General, this is for the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. So the only things he can look into are things that directly involve the Department of Justice and the FBI, which is under the Department of Justice. So he can look into decisions, actions, statements, failure to act of people in the DOJ and the FBI, and he can then determine, or he makes a determination, did those actions in any way violate federal law or federal regulation? So that's what his job was. He did not look into, he had no involvement in looking into anything related to Hillary Clinton and her email server, anything related to Hillary Clinton and the pay for play thing that went on as she was Secretary of State. He had nothing to do with, no statutory or jurisdictional authority to look into whatever it was John Brennan was doing over at the CIA, stirring up his own, hornet's nest over there at the CIA, apparently setting in motion the whole Trump-Russia collusion hoax. Horowitz did not have any authority or jurisdiction to talk to people in anyone outside FBI and DOJ, so nobody over there at the CIA. So his jurisdictional authority was to look into the decision to open the FBI investigation on July 31st of 2016. So he's looking into the question of whether or not the FBI investigation that began of President Trump and the whole Trump-Russia collusion hoax. It began July 2016. Trump wasn't even elected yet, but they had started Crossfire Hurricane. He looked into that. He looked into the 4 individual cases on current and former members of the Trump campaign: Papadopoulos, Page, Manafort, and Flynn. He looked into the FBI's relationship. So that was number 1. Number 2, and the FBI's relationship with Christopher Steele, the fiction writer who came up with, actually he had co-authors, but he came up with the Steele dossier. So you have Christopher Steele, the whole Russian Steele dossier, completely either debunked or conspiratorially written and never proven. I mean, just a bunch of garbage. But anyway, so he had to look into Christopher Steele, whom the FBI considered to be a CHS, confidential human source. Number 3, he had to look into the 4 FBI applications before the FISA court. You realize the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, is what the FBI had to go to get warrants issued by the FISA court so they could continue what they had already been doing, which is spying on Trump affiliates. So the 4 FISA court applications, the report deals with that. The report also deals with the interactions between, he really hones in on the DOJ attorney Bruce Orr, O-H-R Orr. He hones in on Orr and Bruce Orr's relationship with Christopher Steele, with the FBI, with Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS, and the State Department. And basically, whether Orr's relationship with his wife, who was with Fusion GPS, implicated ethical rules. So a lot about Bruce Orr in there. And then also the FBI's use of undercover employees and these CHs, confidential human sources, other than Steele, who were used to try to get a headway into the Trump campaign. So that was his jurisdiction. And again, to be clear, the IG report has nothing to do with the Ukrainian issue that is now the basis of the impeachment effort. So this is what the IG report is. Now I will tell you, just to have all those parameters straight, that's what you're supposed to be doing. So the biggest conclusion, and the thing I want to hit now and at the end of this segment, is this. This Inspector General report finds numerous ways in which the FBI failed to follow its own policies, failed to act in an ethical way, misled the FISA court. There's a series of things he listed in his report where the FBI was out of bounds. But a core finding he made, And the reason it's so important I'll tell you in a second what it is. So a core finding in the IG report is his conclusion that even though all these other things that people in the FBI and DOJ did were unlawful and bad and unethical and misleading, he found there was basically that the very beginning, the genesis, the predicate of the Russia probe was legally justified. And this is a huge issue. We're going to talk about it more at the end. A huge issue, because he's saying, despite all of these evidences of wrongdoing and bias and failure to follow and misleading the FISA court, he still says he finds no reason to question whether the Russia probe was legally justified. I want to contrast what he said, because as soon as this came out, so this is the Inspector General report. The second thing that will be coming out, hopefully soon, on the Mueller, Trump-Russia collusion hoax, will be the results of the large investigation being done within the Department of Justice, Attorney General Barr, U.S. Attorney Barr, Attorney General Barr, and also this U.S. Attorney John Durham. Durham is heading up the investigation to get the very question: was there a legitimate basis for the FBI to even have started this whole Trump-Russia collusion hoax? Was there a legal basis? And so, when this report came out today, Horowitz's report comes out, two statements. I want to read both of them because they really, really matter. One is from Attorney General Barr, realizing that the IG report says there was no problem with the launching, no ethical problem with the launching of the Trump-Russia collusion hoax investigation. Here's what Barr says. The Inspector General's report now makes clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential candidate on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken. So Barr is publicly disagreeing with the Inspector General, Horowitz, and saying, you know what, there was no basis to do this. He's disagreeing with the conclusion the IG says is that, that launching the investigation was justified. And so Barr is way deep in it, far deeper in it than this Inspector General can ever be, because of the limitations of his jurisdiction that I mentioned at the outset. The other statement made today, also by in response to the IG report, is the U.S. Attorney John Durham. Here's what he had to say, and he's the one digging in. Allegedly, he's in front of some grand juries, maybe even working to bring indictments about this concoction of a Trump-Russia collusion hoax, also known as a coup. But here's what John Durham had to say. Based on the evidence collected to date, and while our investigation is ongoing, last month we advised the IG that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to the predication and how the FBI case was opened. So he's saying, Barr and Durham are both saying the Inspector General is wrong. I mean, they're refusing to agree with his conclusion that the opening of the entire case was justified. So beside that, the IG report, you had Democrats out right away saying, see, all of this was just conspiracy theory. No one did anything wrong. Everything's fine. Trump was the bad guy, and, he deserved this, and the IG report bears it out. But the IG report doesn't bear that out at all. They found, I'm going to just give you some of the examples they found. A huge one to understand is they went to the FISA court to get warrants to use Trump's word, wiretap, but to continue spying on Trump officials. And they did that, so they go to the FISA court to get this warrant, and they're required by law, because they're going to get an extraordinary warrant against an American citizen. They're required to spell out in this application the veracity, the basis for believing in the entire Steele dossier, which should have been nothing, which was basically nothing. They skated over that. But the big and specific thing is they're required, if they're trying to characterize, as they were, trying to characterize Carter Page as probably a wrongdoer, possibly a wrongdoer, got a spy on him, and they did not include in their application the exculpatory information, the other side of the story. They put only the facts in that application to the FISA court that made Carter Page look bad, left out the details about him that made him look ethical and good, and in fact probably would have caused the FISA court to say, you're spying on this guy. It's ridiculous. So they left out key information, and they just cannot get away with arguing to the American people that it was mistaken. We didn't really mean to do that. Look at that. We kind of screwed up. So it was described as the IG report was describing that the FBI wiretap on Trump's campaign was riddled with errors, filled with errors. 17 separate inaccuracies across 3 surveillance applications, inflating the justification for monitoring Carter Page. I mean, it struck me driving here today, by the way, I was thinking about this. So Horowitz goes through, this is Michael Horowitz, the IG, the Inspector General for the DOJ. He goes through, they did this wrong and this wrong and this wrong and this wrong and this wrong. List all these things. These aren't like, forgot to put a comma in a sentence. They're wrongdoing. But he says, but at the end, there's nothing wrong with this. I see no reason for them to question why they launched a Trump-Russia collusion hoax. It struck me as how similar that was to what FBI Chief Comey, Director Comey, did when he gave that big statement over July 4th week about Hillary Clinton, and he acknowledged she broke this law and this law and this law and this law, and she lied and she twisted. And we see no reason to think there's a problem here. In fact, he vindicated her in his FBI report. So he's kind of telling the Attorney General at the time, she's fine, leave her alone, she's fine, don't prosecute her. It's the same kind of attitude that Comey had that Horowitz is exhibiting here. I think Comey had more reason to do that, but it's the same attitude. One last point on this, and then I want to turn to the last story of the day, but there's a new... and by the way, all the stories I'm talking about, all the detail, you can always get by going to my website, americacanwetalk.org. On the homepage, under shows, drop down, list of links. All these stories are in there. You can read them yourself. I go out of my way, read them yourselves. I go out of my way to make the data that I read available to you so you can understand it, you can study it yourself, and tell your friends about it. One last point I was going to make about this part of the show today is there's a new argument emerging among leftists in this country, and it is the idea that kind of no matter what happened, what was the intent? And this is what Hillary got exonerated on, because FBI Comey said, Director Comey said, she didn't have intent. She didn't intend to do anything wrong. She didn't intend anything. So the fact that she broke federal laws that have no element of intent required to prove in order to prosecute, so what? This is kind of a leftist, how to excuse the bad guys. We got to let this go because after all, there was no intent. So this is being used again in this case. And I want to tell you how insidious it is, and I'm going to loop back to what I was saying at the start of this segment about how Barr and Durham have weighed in disagreement with the Horowitz conclusion that everything was fine. There was no foul play in the launch of the FBI investigation into Trump and Russia. Suppose you were an FBI attorney or an FBI agent, and you truly, in your heart of hearts, with no doubt whatsoever in your thinking, truly deeply thought President Trump or candidate Trump is dangerous and we don't like him and he'd be scary as president, or I have a gut feel that President Trump probably did something wrong with the Russians, and so even though I can't put my finger on it, I can't prove it, I'm going to go gangbusters to figure it out. So I kind of, bend the rules a little bit. I ignore the standards that justify wiretaps. I ignore the rules about what I have to include in the FISA report. If I really, really thought that Trump was a bad guy, would be a terrible president, or he probably did something with the Russians, I just can't prove it. I just can't find it. And so you didn't have in your heart the idea of wanting to commit a coup, wanting to take the president down. All you really had was a genuine feeling in your heart, this is a bad guy, and I don't like him, and I'm going to find a way, and if I have to bend the rules, so what? The question for Attorney General Barr and Durham is, does that amount to being prosecutable? If they broke the law, they wouldn't have said, or some of them will say, there was no organized coup inside the FBI. We didn't all, have secret late night meetings and plan the coup. we actually believe what we were doing. We believed we were right. And so we cut a few corners. We ignored a few rules. We were right. We had a good motivation. We were trying to save America. And the answer, my friends, is this. You cannot vindicate. You cannot agree that if you intended to do what you thought was the best thing, and you have the power of the FBI and the Department of Justice to ruin people's lives, to launch investigations, to make false accusations, to force people to give you statements under oath, to bring the entire power of the federal government down on someone, you cannot forgive, vindicate, or in any way excuse their corner cutting, their regulation ignoring, their failure to follow procedures simply because they meant well or they thought they were right. It makes no difference at all what they thought. Now, at the very top, the people who were, and I think this was a coup, I think this is John Brennan orchestrated. We're not going to, this is my opinion, John Brennan orchestrated, we're not going to let this guy become president. We're going to do something about it. We're going to get him somehow. Those people, they did commit, if what I believe is accurate, they did commit a coup. The lower level people, though, the idea that they say, well, we thought we were right, it cannot even be giving an iota of weight in the assessment of this situation. And this is what Barr and Durham realized. These people in Washington who did this, not just one time a slight failure to, construct a sentence correctly, or one time a slightly misleading statement to the FISA court. This was on and on and on and on for months. These are people who sworn to uphold the Constitution. They have no right to cut corners, ignore rules, cook up a prosecution, perpetuate the FISA warrant applications to continue spying on someone because they have a creepy feeling that they don't like him. They don't have that right. They must be held accountable to the highest extent of the law. But the big difference, I think, between Horowitz over here and the IG and Barr and Durham is Barr and Durham have a lot more information than the IG could ever have, could have. And so they know more about people outside of the FBI and the DOJ. They know more about the Brennan team and what they were doing and Brennan's assets around the world. They know a lot more. And they are unwilling, I am reading into their statements I read to you, they're unwilling to concede that, well, if the intent was innocent, they had innocent intent, they didn't mean to do anything wrong, they really thought, they believed what they were doing was right. I think that Horowitz, who works for, the DOJ, and he is, he's got to see these people that he is going to criticize wrongdoing. He's not going to do it. He'd rather preserve the institution, call out, failures of failure to follow procedures, policies, regulations, and view it as something to be fixed for next time. But Barr and Durham have a deeper obligation, and I believe they understand that, which is to get to the bottom of this completely hoax Russia-Trump collusion, point out who cooked it up, point out who helped, point out the mission, point out the illegality, and bring indictments.